In Nova Scotia have once again turned the spotlight on violence against women in this country. Most of the 22 victims were women, and the deadly sequence of events started after the gunman assaulted his longtime girlfriend. Well, for more on this, we've invited to the program today Amanda Dale. She is on the advisory panel for the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, and she joins us today in Chelsea, Quebec. Amanda, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, and you know this well, days after the shootings took place, we started to hear these disturbing details that the string of attacks happened after the gunman forcibly confined and assaulted his girlfriend. But you say even before that detail was shared later in the week, you had a sense that this was related to intimate partner violence. How did you come to that conclusion?
So at the observatory, we have, unfortunately, the job of monitoring the murders of women across Canada. And one of the statistical realities is that outbursts of this kind of targeted violence are often rooted in a hatred of women and in a perception of loss of power. And early in the details that were being revealed, we already knew about the fake RCMP vehicle, which indicated to those of us working on the panel that there was an association with an admiration for power, for law enforcement, and of course the use of guns in this case, which is also strongly linked to the terrorization of women in domestic violence situations, was of concern to us early on.
Mm-hmm. And then, as I said, the details emerged later in the week. And when you hear about the gunman, and you alluded to some of it already, but when you hear about the gunman and his alleged past, what goes through your mind?
Well, we were sad, angry, horrified. We have a great deal of information that allows us to predict and prevent domestic violence. And we know that the kinds of things that happened, that are alleged to have happened in this case, including the confinement of his current girlfriend, that is not the act of a man who is committing his first act of violence against women. That is indicated in the research very clearly, far along in an escalating pattern. And we know that this pattern of violence against women is linked with public violence, particularly in Canadian context. And so we were saddened, we were angry, we were hopeful that this might be a watershed for all of us to actually properly investigate, predict, and prevent these murders.
Well, let me pick up on that point, because it really is troubling to think that this violence just didn't happen, because as you say, there would have been earlier patterns, there would have been earlier behaviors. What does that say to you then about how these types of behaviors and patterns are being reported, not being reported, and that kind of reporting being supported by the current system?
Well, we have a long history, going back some 30 years, of the courts directing law enforcement to look at patterns of violence against women. We have charter cases that were settled on the basis of the judges saying, look, police are missing the connection between intimate partner violence that they're taking as a one-off and private, and public violence, which is committed against women and men and communities. And so we do have the information. It does take a significant mind shift, and it takes really talking to the experts who have been working, particularly in Nova Scotia. The women's anti-violence community in Nova Scotia has been very vocal about this particular case, and they need to be consulted in how we could redesign the way that we investigate these kinds of crimes from the get-go.
Okay, let me pick up on that point then. You use mind shift in changing the way we address these kinds of crimes. So how would that shift look like? What would it look like?
Well, I think I've mentioned that we need to see a link between a continuum of violence against women, that an individual
But is that an education process, though, for police? Is that a different way of training and teaching potential police officers what they'll actually be encountering out in the outside world?
It is both of those things, but it's also, as we've seen in sexual assault, working closely with the advocates who are experts in this area during the investigation process to assist in looking for clues that they might be missing.
You know, there will be people that are listening to this conversation right now, and they will think that now is not the time to be talking about this because there are still people mourning in Nova Scotia. What would you say to that?
I understand the desire not to dissect a situation that's so raw, but it's also true that all of us are connected to Nova Scotia as well, and our panel is connected to the East Coast. We have people on our panel who live in the community. And we know that while the investigation is going on is exactly the time we need to ask the tough questions so that we can get the right answers and so that we can prevent this from ever having to happen again.
As we said, the majority of victims in last weekend's attack were women. This country has witnessed so much tragedy. I think about the Montreal massacre. I think about the Toronto van attack, not to mention the tens of thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. What are we still not learning here? You mentioned the police, but what about we as a society? What are we not yet learning about trying to avoid this kind of targeted violence?
I think we have some very scary things to think about in terms of how the signs of violence are around us, and we normalize them as romantic behavior, controlling behavior. We often underestimate its connection to this kind of misogynistic impulse. And I think we have tough questions to ask ourselves in our communities. And I think that's why it's important to talk about this, even while it's still raw.
Amanda, thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.